But to me, it's okay that they think those things, because the way someone thinks about me, I don't have a problem with that. My main thing is I would never want someone to think that I would hurt Gannon or any of the children in our home, because that's just not the case.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at how Ella and Letecia were unequally yoked. Now, the way a relationship is yoked, which is another way of saying attached, harnessed, hitched, tethered, tied together, can literally make or break a relationship. In other words, the thing that holds a relationship together can also be the thing that destroys it. So, and also over time, that thing that in one context, one particular time, can be good for a relationship can later on evolve to be the worst thing for that relationship. So a yoke is something that sometimes needs to change over time. In some instances, the yoke needs to relax, I guess is the word. And in others, although I would imagine very few cases, I guess the yoke may need to tighten. I don't know whether the coronavirus is a instance where the yoke holding a couple together needs to be a tighter yoke. But the point is, this yoke, the bond holding people together, the rope almost holding people together, that material needs to change. The grip on the couple needs to change as times change. One man's hitch is another man's itch. One woman's attachment is another's stranglehold. So one woman might like a certain amount of freedom, whereas another one may want a certain amount of care and protection and attention that to another may feel like clinginess or something. I remember someone, I think it's on Jerry Maguire, someone was saying, what is the modern definition of a stalker? This is at a divorced women's group, and someone said, someone who comes over unannounced. Now, once upon a time, a stalker was someone who sort of was possibly completely unknown to you and was giving you unwanted attention, kind of over a long period of time. Someone who was sort of, appearing through the fabric of society, almost spying on you or following you. Now, a stalker is someone who looks at your Facebook profile or contacts you. That's how that standard has changed. So, for a relationship to last, the ties that bind must be secure but not stifling, protecting but not claustrophobic. A relationship must be a cocoon for those inside it, allowing both people room to breathe, to grow, to expand themselves. At the same time, the ties that bind mustn't be a superglue that makes one feel stuck and rigid in someone else's spiel of how to live. All of this stuff is good and well, but how does it apply to these people? How does it apply to Letecia? How does it apply to Elle and Letecia? Before we get to them, let's familiarize ourselves just with the concept through the Watts case. In the Watts case, the yoking was unequal, principally in the personalities of the couple. And that led to something else that later happened, and I'll get to that in a second. By the way, on this channel is an episode, I think it's been viewed over 30,000 times, on how the Watts couple were unequally yoked. So you can go and check that out. Some people have said it's one of the best episodes on the channel. It was basically, it was an episode based on a blog post on crimerocket.com that virtually no one read at the time. And obviously, once the discovery came out and the book by Sherilyn Cadle, and we heard a bit more from the mistress, we found out firsthand from Chris Watts through the investigators how kind of unequally yoked the Watts couple were. In a weird way, this aspect is still kind of missing from the story of the Watts couple. I mean, almost 2 years later, people are still saying, wow, that, you know, they were this perfect family. They were this perfect couple. They were living this postcard life, right? That's what it looked like. And that's almost why the unequal yoking underneath that was so oppressive, so claustrophobic, because it was all of this effort, all of these resources in service, not of the relationship, but of making the relationship look like it was so wonderful. And that may work for one of the people, and I think it did in the Watt situation, but it can really not work for the other person. And it particularly expresses itself where one is making financial decisions, and the other one is paying for them. So, you know, in the beginning, the dynamic worked for both of them. You know, that the one was dominant and the other passive. The one wanted to take charge, the other wanted someone else to take charge. But somewhere along the line, those dynamics got out of hand, especially for the one being dominated and controlled. When Watts committed triple murder, it was a ratio of him finally taking control, of him stepping out of his passive persona, but in an incredible and horrific display of frustrated dominance. So if we had to boil it down to one thing, distill it down to one thing, what is the main thing where the Watts couple were unequally yoked? What is the main thing that where if you imagine two oxen or two cows or even two horses like pulling a carriage, you know, they have a yoke that is putting them alongside one another so that they can pull on something. That device allows them to pull this kind of cart or wagon or whatever vehicle behind them. But the whole point of this harness is to distribute the load equally. And when you talk about unequal yoking, it is because of something. One of the animals is putting a much heavier load than the other. Now, you can blame the yoke or you can blame one of the animals. You can say, well, one of the animals is weaker and is not doing his or her job, and that is putting all the load, all the onus on the other animal, and it's just sort of unfair and the other animal can't keep it up. So as soon as one animal weakens, the other animal has got to pick up the slack. This is in this analogy, okay? So in the Watts case, the thing that is causing one of these animals to be unfairly burdened was money. Not necessarily too much money, but debt. And where's that debt coming from? So that is the prime sticking point driving the Watts family murders. But if money was the factor there, what was it with Al and Letecia? Was it also money? Just going back to the Watts case, you know, I think that is an aspect that even today, almost 2 years after the incident, most people familiar with the Watts case still don't fully realize the sheer extent of that unequal financial yoking. Why? Because we still don't know how much money Shan'ann actually earned. We don't know what her income was. Now, one would imagine if her income was amazing, that it would be out there. It would sort of be there in black and white. So why isn't it? I mean, why isn't it explicitly provided? What we do know is if you go into the history of MLMs, we know typically that something like less than 1% can kind of make a living out of it, let alone become wealthy. So, and that most people fall out of it within a year or two. It's not a case of people try it out and then they move on to something else. They literally fall out of it. They can't keep it up. There's so much more to say about that, including how these car payments, you know, how the luxury cars are part of that whole scheme. But let's move on to Al and Letecia. If money was this prime sticking point with the Watts family, did it play a factor with Al and Letecia? Was it part of their unequal yoking? Was it also money? The answer to that isn't no, but here's a clue. If you look at the Stauch's home, it's it's almost an inversion of the house on Saratoga Trail, isn't it? The house on Saratoga Trail is like the biggest house. It's a house that dominates the houses on either side, right? It's kind of the biggest house on that side of the road for quite a few houses, right? So with the Stauch family, it's kind of the opposite. That house on Mandan Drive is kind of the smaller house. It's relatively smaller compared to all the other houses on Mandan Drive. So that's already telling you that the financial circumstances of the Stauchs was more modest. It certainly wasn't the kind of extravagance and excessive spending as we saw with the Watts family. So if they had debt or were struggling financially, then their debt would have been less, right? It makes sense just because the house is smaller. Now, without knowing anything about the Stauchs, the scale and scope of the house on Mandan Drive and the scale and scope of the murder of a single child, I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm not trying to say, well, if only one child came to harm, that's not such a big deal. Every crime is a tragedy. Every crime is a nightmare and something that shouldn't happen. So we certainly don't want to say, well, only one child died with the Stauch family. That's one child too many. And with every other family where that happens. I'm simply trying to compare, in a true crime sense, one set of circumstances to another. And so in the one family, a single child is killed compared to what happened in the Watts case. And I'm just saying the scale and scope of what happened in the Stauch family was smaller. It was one child instead of two and an unborn child and a mother, right? And so that indicates, in other words, the scale of the crime in the Watts case indicates that whatever this prime mover was, it was less in the Stauch case. Does that make sense? If we take a global view, just looking at the size of the houses and the scale of the crime, we can see that the prime move in the Stauch case was less, whatever it was. So it's safe to say then that the financial issues of the Stauchs were way, way less than those facing the Watts family. As far as I know, and I'm assuming this based on Letecia's recording, which was talking about the landlady possibly kicking them out, I'm assuming that they rented that house as well, which also means their financial burden is less, as I understand it. So, if they were struggling to pay rent, they could just move out and move into a place that was going to be more suitable to them. When you own a house, you're far more attached to the outcome and caught up in mortgage debt and that kind of thing. And we know the Watts family were 3 months behind in terms of their mortgage debt, and they were about to be sued. They were being sued by the Homeowners Association. Shan'ann hadn't paid the homeowners' fees for about a year. Whether that was deliberately or by mistake, we don't know, but it was a situation they were in. We don't get that sense of indebtedness as much from the Stauchs, do we? So in the Stauch case, we have a strange inversion of the Watts case, where it's the paternal figure this time who's away on a work errand when the crime happens. Also, it's the paternal figure, Al, who was reliably bringing home the bacon each month. In the Watts case, although outwardly and by all appearances Shan'ann was bringing home the bacon or bringing home her share of it, in reality I don't think she was. It's not clear whether she realized the extent of their financial hemorrhage or how fruitless her MLM efforts were at the end of the day, but it's likely her husband knew. And I'm not saying her husband kind of knew MLM didn't work. I'm just saying, for her husband, there was just the sense that they were housebroke all the time, and whether it wasn't his fault or not, I think he blamed her. I think he blamed her for spending a lot. And whether you agree with that or not, one thing we do know is the children going to that expensive school, I think it was $500 a week. It was an expense they couldn't afford and kind of wasn't necessary. You know, if Shan'ann was working from home, why not just have the kids at home and save the $500 that way? I mean, if you're making Thrive videos, why can't you have the kids home all the time? I mean, it's not as though you need to be... anyway, that's a separate conversation. But the point is, in the Stauch home, one member of the family was clearly bringing home the bacon. And when someone's unemployed, they clearly aren't bringing home the bacon. So we know for a fact that Letecia was unemployed on the day of the murder. This alone made her the weaker link in the financial yoking equation. Although Letecia had lost her job on the Friday, Gannon was murdered and his body hidden on the Monday. In reality, she didn't have a job prior to that either. She was doing orientation for a new job, I think for 2 days, in the week ending on Friday. She lost her job on the Friday because she was trying to get a job in late January. For how long she was unemployed before that, we don't know, but that could have played a big role in the tensions and in the unequal yoking as well. What we do know is that there were tensions. We do know the candle incident with Gannon triggered Letecia's sense of financial indebtedness, and indeed her desperation. Although the burned carpet wasn't a big deal in the scheme of things, just as, in my view, Nutgate wasn't a huge deal in the scheme of things, children are often in a situation of peril or near accidents. It's not, you don't have to sort of explode whenever there's something happened. You know, it's accidents happen. People do make mistakes. So even when a serious thing happens, like a fall or a kid almost putting their fingers in a plug, that is part of raising children, right? And so although the burned carpet wasn't a big deal in the scheme of things, for Letecia it was kind of like the psychological straw that broke the camel's back brewing in the back of her mind. So she may have, again, we don't know how long she was unemployed, but Gannon doing that may have made her realize, I can't afford this. I can't, or we can't afford this, or whatever. In a sense, her attack on Gannon really wasn't on Gannon. It was an effort to hold back the walls that were moving in on her, threatening her survival. Not literally. I mean, Gannon setting fire to the carpet wasn't going to set her on fire and destroy her. So it wasn't a literal thing, it was symbolic. In the same way, I think Nutgate was also symbolic. Shan'ann seemed more upset by Cindy Watts saying she needs to learn, you know, how the world works or something like that, or she needs to learn she can't always have her way. That seemed to be what set Shan'ann off, not so much the threat to the child's life of the nuts itself, which was kind of an indirect threat. It's not like Cindy put nuts in front of her in a bowl, right? It was, if you go through the text and so on, it was that statement that Cindy made that she needs to learn that she can't always have her way, that really set Shan'ann off. So it was that almost symbolic thing around that incident that created that whole gate, right? And in the same thing, the candle incident was showing Letecia that she's not in control of her home, or there's a threat to her control of the home, which is through Gannon, and then indirectly Gannon's relationship with his father. and she was feeling the brunt of it. Even so, the financial aspect, though fraught, was far less of a big deal in the Stauch scenario. So what I want to differentiate here is to say, I don't think finances didn't play a role in the Stauch case, but it played a far smaller role than we saw in the Watts case. Letecia's hiring of one car and then another in short shrift indicates her credit was a lot better than the Watts family was, whose credit was completely and utterly exhausted by mid-August 2018. The prime element driving the unequal yoking shouldn't be rocket science. It's in the simplest and most obvious dynamic, the same dynamic Letecia herself was screaming in repeated Google searches. When Letecia complained about how hard it was to be a stepmom, and I think this was something she even sent to law enforcement, where she said something like, "You have no idea how hard it is being a stepmother." She wasn't only shaking her tiny fist at the sky, she was talking about the yoke of parenthood. She had one daughter, Harley, who was almost an adult, able to drive and fend for herself. For Letecia, she graduated through the travails of parenting. She'd already been there, done that. But in her marriage to Al, which started when Gannon was just 5 years old, or 6 years old, and when Lena was 3 years old, she was forced to go through the mothering role all over again, ×2. And this is with someone else's children. The unequal yoke for Letecia was Al's children. Now, you might listen to that and say, no, I don't think that could be a reason. I don't think that could have anything to do with a motive or what made Letecia unhappy. The thing is, you're not her, and you are not dealing with the children. So for you, it's hypothetical, and it's kind of something that really is neither here nor there. But if you think about yourself raising someone else's child, it suddenly that sense of obligation is totally different. And in a weird way, we kind of have a sense of that when you sort of see Chris Watts. He has got 2 children. He wants a third child. It's his idea to have a third child. And then he meets somebody else, and suddenly that child is kind of like no longer his. In other words, although in terms of paternity it is his child, in terms of his loyalties and his change of heart, he's now investing with another person. And so in a weird way, the child is almost like a stepchild. It's not a stepchild, but he no longer wants the child with his wife, and so he's almost making it like that because of his change of loyalties. Does that make sense? I'm just saying that is the reality for him. I'm not saying it's necessarily right. So if you come back to the Stauch case, she had 1 child, he had 2. Her child was low maintenance, his kids were higher maintenance due to their age and dependency, but also due to Al not being around much. There are other psychological factors too that may have played into the yoking, such as the personalities of the respective parents. In a very general sense, Al and Chris Watts seem to be similarly passive, even similarly introverted. Letecia and Shan'ann seem similarly dominant, expressive personalities enslaved to their phones and to social media. It does seem as if Letecia covered her tracks in the Stauch household through dishonesty even before the crime. And here I'm kind of referring to somewhere in the affidavit. It talks about where she sends a message. I can't quite remember who it was to, but she says, yes, I have been lying to Al. He wouldn't believe me anyway. Let me find it for you. Okay, it's on page 29 of the 32-page affidavit. It's point 177. On February 16, 2020, there was a call at or about 1928. Letecia told a female, believed to be Tila Cummings, that she had been giving Al numerous false stories because she knows he will not believe anything she says. So this is obviously something Tila Cummings told law enforcement. So it's sorry, excuse me. This was revealed through a wiretap interception. So while they were bugging her phone, they heard Letecia say, "Well, yes, I've been lying to Al because he won't believe me anyway." And she appears to have a criminal record going back quite some time, which is similar in a way to the Watts family bankruptcy filing preceding the annihilation. So in the same way that the financial quagmire with the Watts family was sort of brewing and getting worse and worse, like a sinkhole under swallowing the Watts house and everyone in it. Something that was happening slowly, but it was sort of getting worse and worse and worse as time went by. With Letecia, that quagmire was a kind of cancer of dishonesty and deceit and lying. And when you're living a lie, it is also like a quagmire that starts swallowing things up. You lie about more and more and more. And as I've always said, not every liar is a murderer, but all murderers are liars. And it's often when the scale of lying becomes so extreme, if you're living a lie about everything, then committing something like a murder for a liar who is that dishonest about everything isn't such a big step. For most of us ordinary people, we may be a little bit dishonest here and there, but something like committing murder is like, wow, that's next level. That's really beyond the pale, right? But for someone who's living a lie in an extreme way, the idea of committing a crime and then lying about it isn't such a big step. It is still a step, but it's not as big a step for them as it is for people like us who are more honest about ourselves. And so what I'm trying to compare here is the level of mendacity with Letecia kind of made her unequally yoked to Al. So if you're in a marriage or a relationship, and the one person's kind of on the level, they are basically a good person, that they do their job, they're not perfect, but they are basically a good citizen, and within the marriage they're basically honest and kind of do their thing. But the other person is lying constantly, making excuses, unreliable, making up stories, and nothing's really working out. That's also going to be kind of a situation of being unequally yoked. Does that make sense? Where one person's kind of holding the fort, holding their own, doing what they need to do. And think again about these two animals pulling the cart. The one is just doing what he needs to do. The other is just constantly stumbling and making excuses. It's going to put more of a burden on the other animal. Does that make sense? And also the animal that can't keep up is also going to get more and more a sense of pain and frustration and embarrassment and shame and feeling like something's got to give, and it's all of this is on me. I'm the one that's the pressure's on, and right, and one wonders whether the murder of Gannon wasn't meant to take attention away from her. Just follow what I'm saying now. And again, we don't know for sure that this was Letecia, but let's assume that it was. Letecia just lost her job. Was Gannon kind of a scapegoat so that Gannon runs away, and now your attention, instead of going to Letecia not having a job and that whole dimension, it goes on to, well, what happened to Gannon? In other words, it's kind of a way of buying herself time. I don't know whether that's the extent of the premeditation, but it could be. On the other hand, it could be just something else. It could be resentment and a kind of sense of retaliation against the people she was surrounded by. So to conclude, when we talk about Letecia's status as an ordinary citizen, I'm talking about in a yoking scenario, it was probably lower than Al's, just as arguably Shannann's employment status as an MLM was less than someone with a proper job, earning a proper, regular, reliable income. So just in that dimension, just in the dimension of a person who goes to work regularly, reliably, honestly, and comes home in that sense. They may not be a perfect person, but they're basically doing what they need to do. Letecia wasn't. She was unemployed, and that just in her status as an ordinary citizen made her kind of lower than Al. Okay? At this stage, until we have more information, it's still too early to speculate on the more sensitive dynamics in the critical area of the personalities and identities of the respective parents, but it does sort of feel like, broadly speaking, Al and Letecia are kind of similar. Not the same, but kind of similar in temperament and in their interests and in their industries even, as Chris Watts and Shan'ann Watts. Chris Watts worked in the male-dominated oil industry, and Al worked in the male-dominated military. You have the same hierarchical structures in the oil industry as you have in the military. Shan'ann was very invested in social media, which is another way of saying magical thinking and fantasy and stuff that's not real, and telling stories and putting up appearances. And Letecia was kind of doing the same thing, very much on her phone all the time, not dealing so much with the real world, although maybe it felt like she was. But that's something we're going to find out more about as more information comes out. I'm very interested in the backstory of Al and Letecia. You know, just where did they grow up? What were they like at school? You know, what's their career track like? So it would be interesting to find out about that. On a personal note, as a young guy, I went overseas. I went to England for 2 years with my girlfriend at the time. We were really in love, and it even looked like we might get married. But we were totally unequally yoked when we went. She went without a proper work permit. I went with a work permit. Because she didn't have the right status, the right legal status in England, she was kind of forced to work. She couldn't just leave a job if she was unhappy, so she was lucky to get a job, but she was also kind of forced to work there. And you know, the woman employing her also knew that she could kind of bully her and get her to do things that someone who was legally working there wouldn't do. So I'll give an example. This woman would sometimes go shopping. So she worked for a guest house, a woman who ran a guest house in Maidenhead, which is outside London. And this woman would go shopping and then pretend to forget her groceries at the store. And then she would ask my girlfriend to go and fetch them for her. Things like that, which no one, and it would happen quite often, which no one would do. You know, no one would put up with in a proper situation. All sorts of things like that. Another example was I would be working, and I would want to go on holiday or go and travel through Europe, and then the woman wouldn't give my girlfriend time off when I wanted it or when we needed it. And then we'd wait for her to give this time off, and she just wouldn't give it. And then eventually I went on my own through Europe. When I got back, that's when this woman gave the time off. And it seemed calculated to break us up, and in the end we did break up because we were unequally yoked. I had the freedom to change jobs and to go travel when I wanted to and do what I wanted to, and my girlfriend didn't. And it just seemed kind of unfair to both of us. But it came down to that sort of legal status. I was there legally with a work permit, she wasn't. And although it's understandable, it kind of wasn't fair to either of us in that situation. And unfortunately, there was a person who took that situation and used it against us, and it worked. You know, it did break us up in the end. I mean, if you traveling together overseas but you can't travel together overseas, it's not an ideal situation. So anyway, I hope you found this analysis interesting and insightful. For those interested, the book Boy Interrupted, The Murder of Gannon Stauch is a number 8 Amazon bestseller in the hoaxes and deceptions category. Thank you for those who bought the book. Thank you for the review that's already been posted, a 5-star review. It is available now in paperback and also as an audiobook on Patreon under the $5 tier. So go and check it out at Patreon/TCRS. I'm also putting up the first book in the Christopher Watts case, which has got the most reviews of any book I've written. Two-Face, The Man Underneath Christopher Watts. That'll be available from Monday onwards, the audiobook of book 1 in the Two-Face series. So check that out. I'll also put a link to the Unequally Yoked video that I did on the Watts couple. I think the video starts to get organized and talk properly about that at about 5 minutes 30. So you might want to push the slider forward to about 5:30 and listen from there onwards. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do. Like, share on your social media, especially Facebook. Leave a comment. And go and check out Patreon. And I'll see you guys next time.